Okay, so I was down here making a few videos, one of the Kyosho RT6 sort of intro slash unboxing, and one for my Laser ZX6 setup. So I figured while I was down here I'd also make a video on my B5M Factory Lite setup. Um, I've had this buggy for, geez, not quite a year. I think around late last summer or so. So maybe 9 months roughly, and I've played around with it a little bit in terms of setup, and I have a pretty good idea of what I'd like to run, at least for my driving style and the types of tracks that I run at. So there's really not much that I change from the stock setup. All I really do is play around with the pistons and oil. I run the same stock springs. I run the same shock locations. I just do pistons and oil, and then maybe make some changes to camber gain and roll center as I see fit, and that's basically it. So, for example, at the front, I run in the stock setting in the manual for the where you would mount the ball stud on the inside would be on the inside of the front tower. Okay, this would be the low camber gain setting, and I personally run it on the outside hole. I find that I like the steering characteristics of running it with higher camber gain. So, generally speaking, as you move this ball stud outwards, you increase the camber gain and you get more steering. Now, what do I mean by more steering? Right? Because there's corner entry steering, there's mid corner steering, there's corner exit steering. Higher camber gain will give you more mid corner steering. So as a car is turning and the chassis is rolling due to weight transfer, okay, the camber will change of the wheel, right? The wheel is going to try to lean out. And if I have more camber gain, this is going to try to pull the wheel back in as the chassis rolls. And what that will do is result in a higher total contact patch between the tire and the track surface compared to running a lower camber gain. So mid-corner, you'll have more traction and therefore more steering, okay? So not everybody might like that. It depends on how much steering you like in your car. But right now, that's what I like. And it's a little bit ironic because about 2 years ago, I bought a B5 rear motor chassis, and I had commented on how that car has so much steering that I could run ribbed tires and it still feels just fine. And then over time, I found that as other people were moving from the rear motor to the mid motor and they had more intrinsic steering, I needed to make changes to the B5 rear motor just to keep up in terms of how the car cornered. And then I eventually caved in and bought a mid motor and had more steering, even just with the low camber gain setting. And now I need even more steering still, and so I go to the outside hole for even higher, for high camber gain. And that's just where I am right now. In terms of the front shocks, again, the stock shock angle, so the mounting holes on the arms and the tower are exactly out of the manual. I use presently 2x1.6 pistons up front with I think 32.5 weight oil. And in the rear, I'm at 2x1.7 millimeter pistons with 27.5 weight oil. So it's a relatively light setup in the rear. And the reason for that is because I'm running on slightly bumpier surfaces now, and so I need less pack and a little bit less damping to accommodate this chassis, especially because it's a mid-motor chassis, right? There's not as much weight behind the rear wheels as you would have in a rear motor chassis. So you have to play all these games with making the rear suspension lighter, maybe pushing a little bit more weight towards the rear, which I don't really do. But really making the rear suspension lighter to account for the fact that there's less weight over the rear wheels and you're running on a looser or bumpier surface, right? If you run mid-motor chassis on an outdoor loose dirt track, you can do it. You can make it work. But, as I said with the RT6 video, it won't work nearly as well as a rear motor chassis. So right now, I'm running on slightly bumpier surfaces, and since that's generally less grip, you need the suspension to absorb more of the acceleration forces rather than transferring those forces through the tires and onto a track surface that's lower grip. Okay, then the tires are just going to spin out. So you have to absorb more of that through the suspension. So I run a lighter oil and a lighter piston to account for that. And this is the setup I run at cruising with RCs, which is a bumpier surface, slightly lower grip than, say, the RCHR indoor track, which is a much higher grip track, but still a little bit bumpy. Not very bumpy, but slightly bumpy. So this setup also works just fine at RCHR. The roll center setting I have is 3 millimeters of spacers under the inner ball stud. I don't remember if that's the stock setting. It might be. But again, if you're running on a lower grip track and with a mid-motor car where there's not as much weight over the rear tires, you're going to need the chassis to roll more to generate grip. And so you need to increase the height of that ball stud to drop the roll center and get more chassis roll. Okay. Also, I do run the ball studs on the inside of this mount rather than the outside. So the front, I kind of do the opposite, right? I run a high camber gain at the front, but at the rear, I run a low camber gain. So the reason for that is because I want to maintain forward traction. As the car is accelerating and weight transfers to the rear and the car squats down, the tires, because there's some finite camber gain, are going to lean inwards. And as they lean inwards, the contact patch to the track drops. And so you have less traction. If you have higher camber gain in the rear, which will make the car steer much more aggressively on corner exit as you accelerate and the car squats, you have even less contact patch between the tire and the track surface. So it'll be very unstable coming out of turns. You will have less forward traction. So I run a lower camber gain to maintain forward bite, especially because, again, there's less weight over the rear tires. You don't have as much traction intrinsically on a mid-motor chassis as you would on a rear motor chassis. Okay. On the hub carrier, I run on the middle hole. If you really need more forward traction, you could take that ball stud on the middle hole and move it all the way to the outer hole on the hub carrier. That will be the minimum camber gain setting in the rear. That'll give you the most forward traction, but the car will, it won't steer quite as much. So it's, natural trade-off you have to pay there. That's basically it with my setup. The only other thing is my motor gearing and timing. I run stock. This is a 17.5 LRP motor. The LRP motors, they're very good. I do like them. The only problem is that they don't have infinitely adjustable end bell timing. So instead of that, they give these little timing blocks in 2.5 degree increments. I think I'm on either the 35 or 37 degree timing, something like that. And for the gearing, I don't run very aggressive gearing at all. It's a 69 tooth spur and a 29 tooth pinion. For a while, when I was running stock with my B4 and my B5 and even this B5M, I used to run 3569 quite often. And it's certainly fast, but it drains the battery a lot because you're pulling a lot of current coming out of turns. So I dropped the pinion a little bit, and at least for the tracks that I'm on, I don't notice any real difference in speed, but I can pull the motor off much at a lower temperature than it would be if I was running 3569. So obviously this depends on the track you're running on, how long this, the longest straight is on the track. But 2969 seems to work pretty well with the 37 or so degree timing I have in this LRP motor. It allows the motor to really spool up, and so I can use the higher RPM portion of that motor. If you're running a bigger pinion, you might not even get to the RPM limit on the motor because the motor's just struggling so much to spool the car up. So that's really it. There's not much that's going on here. A bit on the front camber gain, stock front pistons, but slightly different. I think stock oil too, 32.5. Then in the rear, I play some games with the pistons and oil depending on how much traction I need, and that's it. The rest of it is just practice and driving. So hopefully this is helpful to you. If you have any questions, please post them in the comments section, and thanks for watching.